Hey everyone, welcome back. This is session number 2, and we're going to dive deep into cold email fundamentals. All right, let's get into it. Very briefly, this is what our agenda will be. We're going to go over what the history of outreach was, what it currently is. We're going to talk a little bit about what cold email outreach is, talk about the differences between B2B versus B2C outreach, because that's a common question, when you should cold email, when you should not cold email, and how this course will be structured going forward. All right, let's talk a little bit about the history. So, if we were to wind back the clocks and talk about all the traditional means of sales, um, to summarize, it was all about educating your prospects. Sellers had something interesting to share, so they'd go to the buyers and be like, "Hey, did you know this?" And the whole idea was to make them very problem aware. The difference then was your buyers were not that educated about their own space, right? Information was very limited. So you, as an individual salesperson, had a lot of unique knowledge, which is power, right? So again, let's talk about the traditional channels. It was all door to door, person going door to door and educating them. That evolved into direct mail because it became more cost effective. Distribution was a little bit more advanced, and that eventually evolved into the heavy cold calling and using all these different landlines, right? Eventually, then we get into mobile networks and cell phones and all of that type of stuff. But again, if you really think about it from a 10,000-foot view, prospecting at this time was all about educating, right? Not much has changed from that perspective, but the biggest difference, and it's really important that you know this, is that your buyers were not as problem aware then, right? Today, very different story, in which we'll get into. Following this train of thought, there's this evolution of communication where information is readily available and accessible. And now we're in this information rich economy. So it's very easy for someone to Google an answer to their problem and whatnot. So the value of the seller has really not necessarily diminished, but it's gotten less, right? This also then eventually got pushed into social selling and using all this sort of automation and growth hacking ideas, where a lot of people just wanted to drive a lot of volume. And this essentially became the birth of inbound. And we had a lot of people then, utilizing things like social media, marketing automation with a mix of using your website and pop ups and all of that type of stuff. Heavy content marketing. And we've also seen significant advances in paid marketing as a channel, right? So the whole birth of inbound concept is that we took advantage of the fact that people are out there trying to actively solve for their problems, so let's try to connect them directly to sellers, right? So where does that leave us today? Like I said, our buyer is way more educated, they're way more problem aware than probably you are as the seller. The internet gave us access to everything. So even now, it's super, super important that when we do any of our outreach efforts, we're helpful and relevant and we're able to connect the dots. There is a significant amount of value in curation of insights and knowledge. And we'll talk about this more as the course progresses, but I just wanted to give you that fundamental understanding. So now when you communicate with the prospect, or whether you're as a founder or as a seller, you need to be helpful, you need to be relevant, and you need to help them connect the dots on why your solution could potentially help them solve their problem. Okay, let's move on. So briefly, let's get into it. You probably, some students may already be aware, but like just to make sure everyone's on the same page, what is cold email outreach? Very simply, think of it as a cold call, but you're using email, right? You're finding somebody's email and you're reaching out to them and kind of asking them a question. You might be soliciting them for some piece of advice, but that's what it is, right? One of the advantages, you can really reach out to a significant amount of people if you build out a proper engine, which we will talk about in this course. Um, but it's critical you have something relevant to tell them or offer them, right? There's no point of reaching out to a lot of individuals for the sake of it. It doesn't help anyone. One question I get asked a lot is like, what's the difference between a cold email versus email marketing? And email marketing is part of that whole inbound family. So I want to address this in the start of the course. So Marketing and transactional emails are very user facing. Think about them as your newsletters, receipts, confirmation emails, password resets. Volume from a volume perspective, you can send a few thousand a minute, right? And these are usually contacts who have opted in, right? The tools you use for this stuff is like MailChimp, Active Campaign, Campaign Monitor, and all of that type of stuff. Other differences is that these emails tend to be, HTML focused, so they have images, GIFs, video. They're designed in a very different manner. This is a whole nother channel, and I want to bring this up front, right? Versus cold email is specifically for sales purposes, right? You're reaching out to your prospects within a network, or you're building a list, and you're reaching out with them for the proper business reason. You're not emailing them on their personal emails when an email marketing campaign could be on their personal emails, right? You're looking at low volume, a few hundred a day versus email marketing is a few thousand a minute, right? And the biggest differentiator, and this is really, really important, is that you're using professional or paid email inboxes from Gmail, Outlook, Yahoo, wherever your paid service is from, right? Uh, the tools we use, and we'll talk about this later in the course, is things like quickmail.io, Woodpecker, reply.io, Mailshake. There's a plethora of these tools. Uh, but what these tools do is they automate the sending from a specific inbox, right? Versus an email marketing initiative, you would load it up in something like a MailChimp or a HubSpot, and then they will send it from a dedicated server, right? It's not coming from an inbox, right? Um, Another easy differentiation is that these are cold emails are generally text-based emails, and they're about 100, 150 words, maybe 200, right? So I hope that gives you some idea of what the differences are, because it's pretty important factor. Okay, like I said, they're two very different channels and of communication, and they have their strengths and weaknesses. Email marketing is tend to use for opted in contacts which you're going to nurture down the sales funnel. Versus cold email, it's very top funnel, and you're doing initial outreach to get them interested in your product or service, and then further take them down that funnel. Okay, let's talk about why you'd want to cold email someone. The ultimate goal, and I'm very strong believer in this, is that you want to start a conversation. Like, that should always be your goal, and when you're doing something like this, don't go in it with a goal, but like, yeah, I want to sell an X amount of uh, licenses or ebooks or whichever, right? Like, your fundamental goal is to start a conversation with your prospect and ultimately build a relationship. So please always keep that in mind. That's very, very important. You know, Other reasons you'd want to cold email an individual is, you'd probably want to validate your assumptions around messaging. You want to validate your ICP on who your actual prospects are. ICP is ideal customer profile or persona. We'll talk about that in the course later on. Maybe you want to validate your assumptions around your value proposition if you're in early stage, or even just looking to validate an idea depending on where you are at with the company or the idea. So there's a lot of benefits around it, right? Other benefits is like it is very low cost for you to get things up and running. It's a very scalable channel, and we'll talk about how we do that in this course. How do you make cold email scalable, even if you're just one individual? We've implemented systems like this fairly successfully. It's fairly fast to get a response. You're not putting something out there and waiting for a crazy feedback loop. You'll generally tend to see responses come in within a few days, and then you'll be able to assess, well, what's working, what's not working. It's a great channel for lead generation. It's also a great way for you to educate your prospects, and we'll talk about this in the course, where it's like, hey, if somebody's problem unaware, how do you get them to problem awareness with cold email? Especially, and the last benefit, especially nowadays, is like it's less intrusive. Everybody's in back-to-back Zoom meetings, so you can use cold email as a way to get in front of someone in a very like less disruptive manner, um, and it can be a pretty good way of prospecting and putting it into your cadence. Okay, this is pretty important when you should not cold email, because I get this asked a lot. And I boil it down to these few points here. If your problem's really unknown and not clear, there's no point of burning a contact and risk losing a relationship with them. Even if it's 50% clear, that's better, but don't go in with like, hey, I'm thinking about doing this. Like, what do you think? Right? Don't waste people's time. Time is a very important asset and commodity. Um, if you have a very low sale value um, around your product or service, um, I wouldn't recommend cold emailing because you're probably not going to see the ROI straight away. What I mean by that is like cold emailing is there to start a conversation. So you need to have multiple conversations to convert someone, right? If you're selling a product for like $10 a month, does it make sense for you to cold email someone and really jump on the phone with them like 3 4 times? Probably not, because you're investing way too much time on a deal that, even if it does close, it's very, very small in value. So just something to consider. You should probably do the numbers, but just generally, like a rule of thumb is like if your average contract value ACV is less than $3 4 thousand, it probably doesn't make sense to cold email someone or hire an agency to do that. You're better off using other means. Okay. Um, and another way of looking is also look at your LTV. So if the LTVs are high, then for sure, right? So that's something to consider. The other thing you don't want to do is be emailing consumers, right? Hey, like reaching out to an individual on their personal email ID and be like, hey, we have this great toy for your dog, for instance, or great toy for your kid, or great toy for whatever reason, right? Like you don't want to be sending out anything consumer facing, because um, that's not compliant with international spam and sending laws, right? And we'll talk more about that in the course as well. And finally, like you don't have a legitimate offering or reason to speak to them. Like if like this is goes back to point number one. It's like you don't want to cold email someone for the sake of it. You want to go out there and uh, with a real purpose and reason. Okay. And this is just some nuggets here. We'll dive into each of these throughout the course. This course is really structured around what I call three pillars, right? The first pillar is on cold email strategy. The second one is execution, and the third one is around optimization. So I'll go through what each of these pillars are defined as and what are the subtopics of each of them. And that's how this course will be structured. So you'll see content for those respective subtopics. So let's talk about cold email strategy. Before you launch a cold email campaign, you don't want to just launch it for the sake of it. Be like, hey, I have a bunch of prospects and I have a reason to reach out. Like, let me go. Like take a step back and really think like, who are you reaching out to and why? What's the type of personas I want to hit and why am I reaching out to it? So that first topic there, we're going to dive in like, okay, why are you reaching out to someone? Who are they? And like, can I build a decent persona around all these different variables? And that's really important, right? Because you may have multiple personas, and then if you have multiple personas, then your messages change, right? The second point we're going to be talking about is like, would you want them to do? Do you want them to respond back? Do you want them to go to a dedicated page? Do you want them to join a podcast? Do you want them to read a piece of content? So there's lots of call to actions, which I'll refer to. They're known as CTAs. So that's really critical, because I've seen a lot of people mess this up where they'll send a cold email with like 5 different CTAs, and it's very confusing, right? Um, Another aspect of your strategy is like you want to think like, where does cold email fit in your sales or marketing funnel? Cold email is an activity, it's a top funnel activity. So if your expectation is to do a cold email and get a sale, then your expectations are not aligned, right? Going back to what I talked about earlier. So we'll go over something called the 5 stages of awareness by a very famous marketer called Schwartz, and this will help you get a better understanding of where cold email will fit in your funnel. I'm a big fan of experimentation. I picked up along my journey as a being in growth. So I treat each campaign as experiment. So like fundamentally, each campaign is like, what do you want to validate or invalidate with these campaigns? Are there certain assumptions you want to hit? Are there certain variables you want to uncover? Like, what are you trying to do here? So, like, diving deep into that, that will help you scientifically plan things out a little bit better. And the final question here, which I get asked quite a lot, especially now these days, is like, are you trying to personalize at scale or get eyeballs? What personalize at scale means is like, am I trying to send out like 500 emails with like five custom variables beyond first name and company name? Like maybe it might be something like blog title, last position, and all of that type of stuff. And what I mean by variable is like a piece of information you get online, and that way you can have one template with multiple variables. And as you enrich your contact records, those variables will populate. If that's confusing, we'll talk more about it. But this is a very, very important strategy. And another way of looking at this is like, hey, am I trying to send out mass cold email, which is eyeballs, versus am I trying to be send out highly relevant emails to a smaller cohort of individuals, which is personalization at scale. So we'll talk more about this and we'll see where it goes. And again, there's nothing wrong with either or strategy. I've seen both work, but again, it depends on like what the strategy is, which is really, really important. After that, we're going to go into execution, which is really hands-on. So you'll get to see, what are some best practices on list building? How do you even do some list building? We'll talk about copywriting. What are the best practices on copywriting? What are some, different techniques you can use out there? This is, I've seen a lot of people overcomplicate copywriting. You don't need to be a professional copywriter. You don't need to be a crazy marketer to do this, right? Like, there's a few techniques and a few guidelines we can set up in place for you to be fairly successful at copywriting for cold emails, right? Setting up the necessary follow-up strategy, or just in general the sequence, like what type of sequence you want to run. We're going to spend quite a bit of time going to the technical setup. I've noticed that a lot of courses and content out there doesn't do a good job of this. So we're going to go over something called burner domains and email safety settings. So this is fairly comprehensive. You're probably not going to get all the information or understand all the information in one setting. So make sure to revisit this section because there's going to be a lot of tutorials from that perspective. And then finally, we'll go over compliance with international spam laws because, there's GDPR, CASL, California Privacy Act. So I want to briefly go over best practices on how to generally be compliant with that. Lastly, we'll talk about scaling and optimization. Once you have this channel and once you have a few campaigns up and running, you're like, okay, fine, how do I scale and optimize this? So we'll go over like, hey, what should you expect from a typical campaign? And I'll give you a very, very simple framework on how to optimize those campaigns. But really encouraging you to build an experimentation mindset, and so you can all constantly be experimenting with different items, and so you can scale the necessary campaigns at work. And I'll give you a framework also for that to understand when you should scale. And then I'll also go over some examples that our agency has used for cross-channel playbooks we've implemented. So like, how can you use like cold email with YouTube and website, or how can I use cold email with the BDR and other elements? Because I think there's a missed opportunity there where everyone's just doing like single channel focus, where they're just doing cold email and maybe trying to get a meeting. So there's a lot of opportunity there. That's the end of this session. I hope you found that insightful. Please let me know if there's any questions. If not, we'll see you in the next one. All right, take care.